My pick of the games from round 6 of the Korchnoi Zürich Chess Challenge is Viswanathan Anand against Peter Svidler. This was a wonderful game, I have to say. I'm commentating live in Zurich at the tournament, and it was really enjoyable to see this one. Here we go. Vichy has white, and it's an open Sicilian. And here you can play in many ways. You can play bishop c4, you can play bishop e2 and transpose to a kind of Scheveningen. But Vichy played a very ambitious move, queen e2, obviously envisaging queenside castling, and that's exactly what happened. So now there's threats on the d file, so queen c7. So this is all very natural. And the point of queen e2 is to keep some control over g4, which means that white is still able to play g4. Well, it's one of the points of queen e2, of course. So now we've transposed into a kind of Keres attack, except instead of the queen zipping out to h5 or to g4, the queen is sitting on e2. But this is also quite a menacing square for the queen because it's opposite the king, and black has to be very careful already about the classic knight d5 sacrifice. Well, Vichy played h4. A pretty standard move to start the pawn storm on the king side, and bishop b7. Now the only thing is, black does not have to play bishop b7 here. Of course, it is possible to, maybe move the knight towards the queen side, maybe knight b6, maybe knight e5. One could also play with bishop e7 and castle. But, I mean, bishop b7 is a very natural developing move, of course, looking at the e4 pawn and making way for the rook to come to c8. But the only problem with bishop b7 is that it somewhat weakens the e6 pawn. And of course there's a lack of development on the king side. Looking at my database, I see that Ivanchuk once played bishop h3 in this position, and that is not a bad idea, with the idea of knight d5. And well, a crazy game, which finally ended in a draw. Objectively, probably not better for white at all, but very interesting. Vichy played with a3. So just putting the brakes on black's queenside expansion for the time being. Rook c8. So it's all very natural. Bit of pressure on the c-file. Now Vichy played bishop h3, and here is a big moment in the game for black. It's not easy, not an easy decision to make. It's not really possible to develop with bishop e7 because this sacrifice, well, you can barely call this a sacrifice because it's so natural, and white isn't even material down. White gets 3 pawns for the piece and an absolutely crushing attack. So just very natural, very easy. There's knight e5. Now that could potentially create some problems when the knight comes to c4 and looks at these points here with pressure on the knight on c3. But black has to contend with this sacrifice again, and this is potentially very, very unpleasant actually for black. So let's go back. There's also knight takes d4, but that would bring the bishop to a very fine diagonal, and again knight d5 still comes into consideration in some positions. After over 5 minutes thought, Svidler plumped for b4, and of course this looks like a very sensible idea to open up the c-file, open up lines on the queen side, and the knight is in quite a menacing position on b4. But Vichy came up with a superb riposte. And I think this is absolutely necessary in the position, actually, because black's counterplay on the queen side, it's coming very quickly. Vichy sacked a piece on e6, not with the bishop, but with the knight, leaving the bishop on e6. And after the game, Vichy said that he was really pleased to get this in. It's not just that the bishop is on a superb attacking square, clearly preventing black's king from castling if the bishop moves, but it's actually also really important for the defence. And Vichy said after this he felt very safe. I think that's a funny way of putting it. But he is absolutely right, of course, that suddenly his king is much safer with the presence of the bishop on e6, looking in both directions. Svidler played queen a5. I mean, I think this is really the only way to go. And you can see that without that bishop, then black's threats are really strong. You know, check and queen takes b2 threatened. Sometimes one can take here as well. However, with the bishop on e6, Vichy is able to construct a defence, and this is a really remarkable move, and takes great confidence to be able to play this. He played king b1. And I think this is the star move of the game, actually. How many players would have the guts to move their king back towards some kind of potential attack? But it's all possible because of that bishop covering crucial squares on the queen side. Can also sometimes block on b3 as well. Now, this is not an easy position for either colour, and this is a tough decision for Svidler. If bishop e7 doesn't really help at all, bishop d4 hits g7. What else? Well, d5 is tricky to open this one up and to close the diagonal, but well, Vichy thought afterwards that bishop d4 was a very strong move, and it's still looking like it's very good for white. Rook takes c3 played. I think, well, probably objectively the best move, actually. So Svidler ditches an exchange, and the knight drops back to c6. So the material balance is now 2 knights against a rook and 2 pawns, which, well, I suppose it's a rough material balance, but yeah, still a very tricky position. Vichy played rook h3. So also, he wasn't quite sure how to go here. I mean, he spent 9 minutes on rook h3. He also considered f4, but, well, it's always nice to have a rook looking over at this side of the board, and if, for example, queen takes c3, this doesn't work at all now. Oh, it's a nice refutation. Queen h5 check. If the king steps to a black square, then bishop b6 check, and rook takes queen. So g6, yeah, obviously king e7, then queen f7, followed by mate. So g6, and this opens up the diagonal, check with the queen, and then bishop d4, and that's not very pleasant. Well, it's pleasant for white. So Svidler played bishop e7, and again Vichy wasn't sure whether he should play f4. Probably f4 is a better move, but well, as Vichy admitted afterwards, he kind of lost a tempo here. f4 is a better move. But he played bishop d4, and after knight c5, he thought he'd better take this one off before the knight does some damage here, or yeah, looks like it could come here as well. So anyway, he took off the knight, queen c5, and then played f4. So notice how Vichy is very careful. Now, I know that this is a shorter time control. They're playing 45 minutes, and on the clock, and then 30 seconds added per move. But you know, it's pretty fast, and this is typical Vichy, that although he's sacrificed a piece, he makes sure that his king is pretty safe above all. King d8, and here's another example of that. Suddenly he realised, well, king c7 and rook b8, things are starting to be a little bit unclear, so okay, let's take the sting out of the position and play queen e3 and trade queens. Svidler traded, and probably he should play king c7 here. And Vichy thought the position was still actually in the balance. But Svidler played h6, which actually on the surface of it looks pretty sensible, to try and break down this pawn on g5. It's interesting how very often in these Kerrer's attack type positions, the pawn on g5, it's quite positional actually. It's all about restricting the bishop on e7. It really can't come into the game, so very important that white keeps that pawn on g5, maintains the pawn on g5. But it seems as though h6 was a mistake, and Vichy thought that after c4 he was doing really, really well, and the simple threat is to play c5, and indeed if king c7, then c5 is still possible, because if that's taken then there's a rook check. Svidler exchanged pawns and then played rook f8. So he's trying to, well, induce white into playing f5, which is what happened. And at least in that case, you know, he has the chance to maybe take here at some point and bring the knight to e5. Now, clearly this one, bishop takes g5, isn't working at the moment because that's just way too strong. And don't forget, this rook can swing over to b3. Now that's really nasty, just to add to black's woes. So knight e5 played, and this is a very nice move. Rook g1 from Vichy. Excellent move. The point is that white is now threatening to play f6, and when that's taken, then g6, g7, and the pawn rolls home. Or at least it would cost a piece. So in this case, black is really stuck. So d5 played. I mean, Peter is. This is just desperation. He's lost at this point. Rook b3, nice move. So that has to be defended, and then c takes d5. So that's just another pawn in the bag, and the bishop is completely cut out of play, and there's still this nasty threat. And the game concluded. Rook h8, f6. Same idea. If this is taken, then the pawn will roll home. So bishop f8, just about hanging on, but now here's a really elegant winning move. d6. And that just overloads black's pieces. Obviously king takes, the rook, the bishop drops here. If bishop takes, then the pawn on g7 drops. And if the king moves up, then we've got bishop d5 check. And if king back, then bishop d5 again. So that was the final position. d6, a really attractive finishing move. And Vichy's play in this game really reminded me of the young Vichy, when he would just kind of steamroller his opponents off the board in double quick time. It's a hark back to his youth. So a great game. I've got to run off and commentate on the final day of the Korchnoi Zürich Chess Challenge, where there's going to be a blitz tournament which gets added to the final totals. So I don't have time to look at a game from round 7, but hopefully I'll do one more video and try to wrap up my coverage from this splendid tournament in a day or so anyway.